Right, I think we'll just allow a minute or so for more people to join us, and then we'll make a start. Okay, I think the numbers joining are starting to sort of level up a little bit. So I think we'll make a start now, and people can join us as we go along. So first of all, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Wray, and I'm a director of Nature Positive, where we look after companies who want to reduce their impacts on biodiversity, and I'm chair of CIEEM's Strategic Policy Panel. So this is the second of two webinars that CIEEM's hosted on CBD COP15. The first one is already available on CIEEM's YouTube channel if you'd like to look at it, and if you're a member also in the Resource Hub on the CIEEM website. This webinar will be recorded and it will be added to the YouTube and Resource Hub as well, so you'll be able to see it then. Today we're talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity and its 15th Conference of the Parties, COP15. Now, part one of that process of COP15 was held virtually last October and resulted in the Kunming Declaration. The second part is due to take place now at the end of April, beginning of May in Kunming, China. And at that point, we expect a new Global Biodiversity Framework to be agreed. So the first webinar last week focused on biodiversity threats, conservation and restoration. And today we're going to have a panel discussion and then an audience Q&A, which will focus around resources, finance and business engagement. So you're welcome to add any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during the webinar, and we'll come back to those towards the end and try to answer as many of them as we can. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce today's panel. And I'll just let each of them in turn tell you a little bit about who they are, their background and their interest in this topic. I'm going to start, if I may, with Signe Norberg.
Hi everyone. So my name is Signe Norberg. I am Head of Public Affairs and Communications at the Aldersgate Group. And essentially I've got a background in both the public and private sector, but really I'm here today to talk about the work that we do on nature and the importance of this issue for our business members and moving this agenda forward. So really pleased to be with you here today. And yeah, sorry, Steph, do you want us to do our opening remarks as well?
We'll come back to that. We'll just do introductions first. Thank you. And next on my screen, I've got Bruce Howard on mute.
Hello, I'm director of the Ecosystems Knowledge Network, which was originally set up by government, by DEFRA, with involvement of government across the UK. If you think of sometimes the stories we get, gloom and doom stories from conservation NGOs about the loss of biodiversity, we're out to put a spotlight on the positive examples locally around these islands of people connecting the environment with well-being and prosperity.
Thank you very much. And next, Kate.
Good afternoon, I'm Kate Parminter. I'm the chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on the Environment and Climate Change, which is a new committee that the Lords introduced last April. So it's been a busy 6 months or so for us. And I've been in the House of Lords for 10 years, sitting on the Lib Dem benches, dealing mainly with environmental animal welfare issues. So again, it's been a busy year with the Environment Act for us this year.
Absolutely. And then finally, David Young.
Hello, my name is David Young. I'm a senior fellow with the Broadway Initiative, which is an umbrella organisation for business and environment groups to come together and shape the post-Brexit environmental agenda for government. I'm here predominantly today to talk about work on the Financing UK Nature Recovery Initiative, of which the Broadway is a founding member. My background is as originally an environmental scientist and the founding of executive director of Natural England.
Thanks very much, David. So as you can see, we've got an incredibly well-qualified panel today to give us some great insights into these issues around business and biodiversity. You can add questions to the Q&A function at any time as we go along. We'll deal with them all at the end. So first of all, then we'll do what we said, and we'll let each of the panelists just give a few minutes opening remarks to let us know, what their main issues are regarding this agenda. And I'm going to do that in the same order that we just did. So starting with Signe.
Thank you. I think that from my perspective, the first part of COP15 and the progress that we've seen this year is a really welcome step forward. But I think that it's also important that we acknowledge that there needs to be quite significant progress over the course of next year to have some more tangible outcomes from the COP15 negotiations. And that for me, it's particularly important that ambition is maintained, that we have at a high level, that there's a significant clarity on the international framework going forward, so that we can see different nations stepping up and delivering important commitments. And what that means in practice is that we need to see quite significant progress in terms of the 30 by 30 target for land and sea, but we also need to see those interim milestones or targets being quantified at an international level, so that it helps businesses across different geographies understand where the direction of travel is going, and that there is a coherent framework being put forward towards reaching that 2050 vision that they emphasize during the negotiations. And in order for that, as you can maybe imagine, the kind of key operative word here is around the implementation and delivery coming out of the negotiations. So seeing that focus around the delivery mechanisms and a whole government approach will be particularly important, as well as understanding the value of nature better. We only need to look at the Dasgupta review, which was published earlier this year, to see that there is quite a long way to go to fully understand the picture of biodiversity in nature. And we need to see the negotiations be part of that dialogue and driving that agenda forward. And underpinning that, we need to see specific policies, regulation, guidance coming out of it, so that there is that comprehensive framework for each of the nations to bring forward this agenda. And then finally, just briefly, I think it's very vital that we acknowledge that we also need to provide the foundations for nature-related disclosures. We have seen some significant progress with the climate disclosures over the past several years, but we now also need to see that being mirrored on the nature side, and that these are frameworks that work together so the businesses can undertake both, and that they make sense and make cost-efficient changes. So I think that all in all, we've seen some very significant positive signals come forward, but we need to see some more of that detail come forward, and hopefully the announcements at COP26 will kind of provide that platform. But I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you, Signe. There's a huge amount there, very much around about the need to show progress. We've got used to missing targets on biodiversity, haven't we? Getting right up to the deadline and realizing that we're nowhere close. So this theory of change and the interim stages are going to be hugely important this time around. Bruce, can I turn to you next?
Sure. I think I'm optimistic at this point, this stage in COP15, optimistic sort of internationally, and we see some great initiatives like the financial institutions statement on COP15 with lots of financial institutions, I think 10 trillion in assets coming together to basically want to play their part in delivering the new framework. Where I'm more unsure is about UK leadership on this. It's fine to think of a sort of top-down, large financial institutions, international agreements being made, But within the UK, we need to show what this financing and resourcing of nature recovery looks like in practice. And for that, we need to be much smarter with the way that we're using public finance. At the moment, it seems throughout the UK, politically expedient to give out grants, sort of often sums of money that aren't really related to the size of the problem, but they are there to perhaps appeal to conservation NGOs and show that the politicians are sort of on it. But those sums of money, I think it's pretty clear, are never going to be adequate. So we need to be much smarter within the UK at catalysing private finance, so blending public and private and philanthropic finance. The environment is no longer a charity case, and government must recognise that. The other final point I'd like to make is it's not just about the money, it's about the local structures which can broker these new financial relationships involving the private sector, both financial services and the rest of the private sector. And we don't have those structures effectively in any part of these islands to do that brokering. It's very difficult work bringing together the sellers of environmental restoration and all its benefits and the buyers. It's very tricky, messy, time-consuming work. And we simply don't have the sort of social infrastructure, as it were, the administrative infrastructure to do that fairly and equitably. In England, for example, local nature partnerships, a lot of them, perhaps the majority, have fallen by the wayside, even though they would have been ideal brokers of new relationships between businesses and private, public, third sector organizations that look after land and water. So we desperately need those local structures to do the negotiation for new environmental markets.
Thanks, Bruce. It's really interesting on that financial side that there is a sense that there are trillions of dollars waiting to be invested in ethical ways that restore biodiversity. But it's, yes, there's the structural element, but also there's the understanding of the market element. That market is so new that doesn't really seem to be established yet, and way to make those that capital flow really.
Yeah, it's fledgling. There are some great examples, which I'm sure David can point to, and I could too, of where this new finance involving the private sector and the public sector is being brought together. But it is still early days.
Absolutely, thank you. Kate, can I move on to you, please?
It was sort of following on from the theme of sort of optimism and hurdles in terms of delivering or hoping to deliver a successful CBD next year. I think we can be optimistic about the political climate that we're going into. We only need to think about the fact that nature was for the first time focused in COP26. There was the wording in the final communique. There was the leaders' declaration on forests and land use, and the joint statement on the fact dialogue. So COP26, in a sense, has helped set us up well for COP15. And equally here in the UK, as Bruce said, we need to be focusing on what's happening in the UK. We've had the Environment Act. It's a framework bill, but let's be clear, it's got a state of nature target in there, which is a really good signal to other countries about delivering on biodiversity targets. So that's the good stuff. The hurdles, let's not forget the US is not part of the CBD, and a lot of the successes at COP26 were brokered through the big players working collectively together. And I think that is a downside. And equally, there are challenges in the fact that the host nation, China, has, I think how I should put it delicately, a quite tricky relationship with the UK on a number of issues. And obviously, we want to see a number of the COP26 nature things followed through in this year. And as president of COP26, we have that opportunity. But there is an issue about the relationship between the UK government and the Chinese. And my committee actually called in the Chinese to come before our committee to talk about COP15, because we believe we're not apologists for anybody, but you need to talk to people, whereas other committees said we're not going to speak to them, and we feel that was important. But the Chinese representative from the embassy, because the ambassador was not in post at that time, made it quite clear that the difficult relationships between the UK and China are making it harder to deliver a successful outcome. So I think that is an issue. And then the only final thing I wanted to mention is these things aren't going ahead in sort of global isolation. There are other events going on which need to be moving in the same direction. And as we speak, the World Trade Organization's 12th ministerial conference is going ahead. We really need some strong signals from that, maybe some multilateral commitments on trade and environment, because unless trade and global trade is moving in the right direction, whatever we determine at CBD next spring, it's just not going to hold.
Absolutely. And what's your feeling on that, Kate? Do you think that we will get those strong signals back from the World Trade Organization?
Well, it's quite hard. We had a letter back because we asked George Eustace about what the government was doing to ensure that all the opportunities between now and Kunming were taken up. They were talking at a fairly sort of civil servant level about how they were trying to get pressure to get work streams moving forward on trade and environment, which is good. But I don't think we as a committee felt there was quite the necessary high-level political commitment, and this is a ministerial conference, so that's where, I mean, as we know in all things, it's great to have the civil servants, and it is great in the UK that we've got civil servants who can deal with this issue, but we need that political will.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And then finally, David, if I could come to you.
I suppose I share Signe's optimism about the overarching sort of framework and targets that are emerging for COP15. I'm less persuaded around the sort of drivers of the finance, of catalysing the finance that's going to be required, both the private finance and, as Bruce has referred to, the better use of public resources. And if we just take England as an example, you know, we have a 25-year environment plan, and now, as Kate's pointed out, an Environment Act, but we have no strategy to finance its delivery. And it's quite clear that government resources and philanthropy are just simply nowhere near enough in terms of what's required. And that was the genesis of the Financing UK Nature Recovery Initiative, which commenced in November 22, was to look at, well, what are the barriers? Because I think, as Stephanie said, there's a lot of private sector finance sitting out there waiting to be invested in the natural environment. They're seeing the opportunity, but it isn't happening. And why is that the case? One of the things we wanted to make clear was the size of the gap, and one of our partners, the Green Finance Institute, led a project that was done by the FTech and Raymond Consulting, who basically put the figure as a minimum of £44 billion to deliver on existing nature-related obligations across the UK out to 2030. When you look at the numbers of billions that were announced at COP26, it's in many cases the initiatives are a fraction of what we need to spend in the UK alone. Yeah. So our work has been very much about looking at the barriers and levers to private investment and putting in place the market design, the governance, and then the practical delivery mechanisms, as Bruce said, in the local environment to unlock this private sector investment. And I would just finish on saying that I think Professor Dasgupta put it pretty clearly. The reason we're in this parlous state is as a result of widespread institutional failure. And we're not going to achieve the resolution of that failure with a bit of tweaking at the edges and business as usual.
Absolutely, yes, indeed. And it's interesting, isn't it, that actually whilst there was perhaps nothing very new in the Dasgupta review for people who work in this area, what was new and what was really striking about it was that this was a report by the Treasury, that, you know, saying things that we never necessarily expected the Treasury to say. How do you feel, David, or indeed anyone who wants to come in, how do you feel we've moved on that? How do you feel the response has been post Dasgupta?
That's a very good question. Look, I think your observation that Dasgupta was championed by Treasury was very important. I mean, it was not lost on me that it was, 15 years since the Stern Review came out, and of course, the sad thing about that is the basic recommendations of the Stern Review, which was act now and we'll save a lot of money into the future, and that there is still a chance to avoid the worst problems of climate change, is unchanged 15 years on. We can't have the same for biodiversity. The Dasgupta review can't be looked back on in 15 years' time as oh yes, he got it right, but we didn't take the action that was required.
Yeah.
So I think the Treasury is minded to that, and I also agree with Kate. I think the political environment is favourable, provided it can be a shared responsibility between the public and the private sector to deliver.
Absolutely. Signe, you've got a hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think David certainly summarised it very well. I think the only thing I would add to that is that I also think that one thing in terms of taking the Dasgupta review forward is also to look at what does sort of a delivery plan for that look like. We've obviously had the government's response to the Dasgupta review, but looking at how we're truly embedding this domestically, I think that there's still some room for further progress and some more tangible actions which Treasury can embed into its own its own operations to clarify exactly how it's taking the recommendations from the review forward. But that said, I think that also the government's response also highlights the importance of also having international progress on this agenda at the same time. But I think for the UK, it will be quite important to look at some kind of delivery plan or embedding mechanism to truly make sure that those recommendations are taken forward.
Absolutely. I'll be looking forward to when there's a chief ecologist at the Treasury. Okay, well, Kate touched on the issues around COP26 in her opening comments. So before we move on to COP15 fully, how do any of the other panelists feel about the sort of the positive outcomes out of COP26 in terms of finance for nature and nature-based solutions? I'm going to come to Bruce, I think.
Sure. I mean, one of the great things through the, I mean, there's actually what was agreed at COP26, which has benefit. There's the whole narrative, the public discourse, which is possibly far more valuable than actually what was put on paper. One initiative that was great to see was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which obviously emerged, I think, back in the spring, but came to the fore in COP26. So that was, from my perspective, particularly encouraging. What we don't have, though, is an understanding of what the environmental, what basically biodiversity conservation, environmental restoration can do for net zero. And I'm looking forward to the authoritative report that shows in quantitative terms what the environment can do for net zero. Lots of politicians, local and national, they love putting a tree in the ground and it always is great for climate. But actually, 1 tree or 1 million, what is it actually doing for net zero? I think when we get that clarity, plus the likes of these financial services declarations, then the role of nature in net zero will be very exciting.
I wonder if perhaps it's beholden on us as environmental professionals to take this sort of the fact that these things are inextricably linked forward to COP15, and maybe we need at COP15 to be talking about climate in the way that we did manage to get nature on the table in Glasgow.
A really good thought. We recently ran a conference, the Natural Capital Finance and Investment Conference. I wanted a session on nature's role in net zero. In the end, it basically didn't happen because we just couldn't find in the public, private or third sector people who would speak in quantitative terms on this. Yeah. Great idea to turn the tables COP15, so nature and climate are also connected there.
Absolutely. Thank you. David.
Unusually, I'm going to slightly disagree with Bruce on this one. I think that one of the problems with the way nature was framed at COP26 was that it was framed as a solution to climate. And in fact, as I think some of you be aware, a range of NGOs, including Greenpeace and Rainforest Foundation and others, have actually said they're particularly unhappy at the way nature-based solutions are being positioned as a sort of utilitarian outcome for, mitigation. I've always used the term nature-based solutions to be the nature-based solutions to the full range of environmental challenges, whether it's water quality, biodiversity, air quality, mental health, for example. I mean, nature's just, as Dasgupta's illustrated, just such a critical aspect of every aspect of our lives. And so I was a little bit taken aback by that. But when I thought about it some more, I think that is a part of the narrative that we haven't got right. I don't think we are talking about nature for its full range of benefits in the context of COP26. And I can understand why that would be. Obviously, the focus of COP26 is on climate. But I would hope that COP15 is very much about that full range of value of nature and how we can finance nature to deliver that full suite of value.
Yeah, absolutely. So what then does COP15 need to deliver if we're going to put nature on the road to recovery, particularly in relation to these sort of financial and resource implications that we're talking about today? What are the things you'll be looking for? I'm going to go first. I'm going to go to Kate first.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's be clear. I mean, it was good at the first part of the CBD that the Chinese came up with their, what was it, 233, someone correct me if I'm wrong, $233 billion fund, which was a good opening gambit. I mean, no one says that's anywhere near what we need. I mean, we're talking billions every year, but it was a good opening gambit, and it was supported, I think, certainly supported by us in a modest way, by the European Union, by France and Japan. So some of the major G7 countries came in behind. So that was a good start, but we need to see the rest of the G7 in advance of the spring event flagging up that they will be making strong contributions to that initiative as well, because we know it's not just targets, it's not just having the monitoring mechanisms, it is about commitments on resourcing. So for me, it's about getting some of those G7 countries stepping up to the plate early. And the other thing for me is around turning around quite a lot of these environmentally harmful subsidies. I mean, I think we're not, sadly, in the space we are in at COP26, where we've got Mark Carney literally going around and collaring people in the finance community to step up to the plate. We're not there yet on biodiversity. Whether it's because we need, some more of the metrics and the task force on nature-related financial disclosure to, create the platform for that to happen, I'm not sure. But we're not where we are with biodiversity as we were with climate financing. So turning around some of the subsidies, particularly in the agriculture field, I think is, for me, the most opportune thing that we need to be going for.
Excellent, thank you. Would anybody else like to add to that? I've got two at once. I'll go to Signe, then David.
I was just gonna add that I think also one thing that I think on a big picture level, one of the important things that COP15 really need to deliver is a kind of global roadmap going forward. And I think that, I mean, as Kate rightly said, I think targets aren't everything, but I think that having interim targets will still be very important just to make sure that we keep the foot on the pedal, so to speak, going forward. And there is that mechanism to hold countries to account and assess regular progress. I think also the quick reference to metrics will also be incredibly important to see that being agreed, if not fully, at least to a higher degree on an international stage. I think can really help catalyze a better understanding of nature as a complex area, to help incentivize investments and so on. And then finally, the other point I just want to make was just around the nature related disclosures framework, where I think that is also something that I would look forward to seeing further progress on, just because even where that's still being developed, I think that there's a lot that countries can do to encourage businesses to already think about the risks that they have, to think about where where they're exposed, but also where are the opportunities for them to take further action, so we don't get sort of almost a cliff edge once they kind of come in, but we have that gradual understanding and embedding into corporate practices following on from this. But obviously the big challenges is part of that, but I think that there's a few different bits there that I would look forward to seeing some progress on.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point on the availability of metrics and the link to disclosures. People can use the lack of an agreed disclosure protocol as an excuse to put their head in the sand about this issue for a little bit longer. Whereas in reality, although we don't have an agreed framework yet, there's lots of tools out there that people can use to start reporting on this. They should, as good business governance, be looking at what their dependencies on nature are and what risks there are in their business value chain. So really, we can be making a start on this, can't we?
Absolutely, completely agree with that.
David.
I'm a little concerned that basically at the COP15 we might follow Bruce's analogy in the UK of sort of dishing out a few billions of pounds here and there to a range of initiatives, knowing full well that it's vastly under what is actually required. I think we also know that a range of countries, including in the UK countries, we have biodiversity strategies which are under-resourced, or as I mentioned before, not even resourced at all in a strategic sense. It would seem to me that it may be better actually to have a performance measure on countries that they have biodiversity strategies and can demonstrate that they are fully and properly resourced. Now, if that was to be applied in the UK and our minimum estimate of 44 billion through to 2030 was to apply, and then you multiply that up across every country, that suddenly starts to become a larger number. So I think properly resourced domestic biodiversity strategies is, and holding countries to account to that resourcing might ultimately deliver more than focusing on a global number that is actually kind of sort of sounds like a big number, but we all know is nowhere near what's required.
Yeah, breaking it down into chunks that are manageable. Yeah, thank you, David. Bruce, I'm going to turn to you next to say, I'm sure you've had a look at the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. What do you think it's saying enough about finance and resources? Is it clear about the resources and finances that are needed to deliver on it?
No. I think from my reading of it, that the presumption is we need this sort of giant pot of money. What is it? 700 billion. Sorry.
Billion.
2030, that's mentioned. 700 million wouldn't be much with it. 700 billion. So there's this idea of just this giant pot of money. What we need to be thinking much more carefully about when it comes to flows of finance and biodiversity conservation are supply chains, as Signe has indicated. It's not a question of sort of amassing a pot of money and then dispersing it as best we can around all the different nations with their needs. There's got to be a lot more attention to supply chain governance. And the TNFD, the Task Force Nature-related Financial Disclosure, a great sort of part of that. But I think we need a lot more. And while these international pots of money are amassed, I think we've got to demonstrate this at the UK level. I know that can't be written into the framework, but we've got to show a coordinated financial plan for the natural environment that is economically efficient. That would be a major contribution to UK leadership. Not, George Eustice or whoever rocking up and sort of tossing in, however many billion into the global pot. That's drop in the ocean.
Absolutely. You can almost see there's some kind of huge matrix between countries, can't you, as to needs and ability to pay and working out where the capital has to flow between them, like some extremely complicated sorting out of a restaurant bill.
There's a very good analogy there. Yes. Some of that might need to be bilateral. So two people round the table in that restaurant saying, look, we'll cover this, we'll form an agreement together, rather than trying to wait for every nation that's participating to pay its share, because that negotiation is endless.
Absolutely, and we really don't have the luxury of that sort of time, do we? So, David, I'm going to turn to you next. How would you say that business is engaging at the moment with its impacts on nature?
With very few exceptions, almost not at all. It's a peripheral matter for most, and really only comes to bear where there are regulations, at least in the UK context. There are some notable exceptions. The very sort of well-touted example of Nestle, who has, I think, assembled $1 billion US for its the operations around the world to invest in the food supply chains, and the local enterprise network model that has been developed in the UK is a mechanism that they're using. I think that some of the private water companies in the UK are trying to make progress, but are basically totally hamstrung by archaic economic regulation and highly prescriptive and risk-averse environmental regulation. And at the Broadway initiative, we see that the one-off opportunity that comes from Brexit is to rethink the way in which environmental regulation catalyses improvement in the environment, rather than constantly just trying to sort of micromanage every aspect of the environment. So there are examples, but few and far between. I do think that the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures needs to be given a very strong support by government and by business, because it will bring in standardization, it will bring in the metrics, it will bring in the systems and processes to ensure that investment in nature is not greenwashing. And I think people like the National Investment Bank may also have an important role there in supervising some of these markets. So I think I'm optimistic that we will get there, but there's a lot of missing governance and and market mechanisms that are missing before business can step in and play its part.
Absolutely, we've sort of got an argument there for sort of more governance in some areas and less tight governance in other areas. And I quite appreciate where you're coming from, certainly in relation to the water industry, where you know, the AMP cycle and the pressures on capital spend, you know, positively present. It's another example of these subsidies that drive our behaviour in the wrong direction, isn't it? We're incentivizing the wrong behaviours by how we regulate in some ways. But of course, to regulate in an intelligent way, to be able to weigh up the right course of action, requires investment in that regulator and investing in the environmental profession.
Yeah, exactly. So I will just jump in, but I think that it's also crucial to look at also making sure that we have regulators that are well resourced as part of that as well, to carry out the functions that we expect of them as part of this, to maintain integrity essentially in these markets. And I think that also looking at using the UK again as a specific example, we have the Environment Act now, we have targets within that. And with it, we will have new expectations on government and other public authorities to deliver environmental improvements, as well as kind of prevent environmental degradation. Both are a small difference, but it's still a distinction, I think, if that's worth to be made, that we will need to see both of those things come in. But with that, I think that we have the potential to have something that can act as a catalyst for further action. Because if we look at where, for instance, the development of a targets framework can be helpful, it can help signal the impact, where we measure impact on nature, for example, for the private sector. So having a very credible environmental governance in the UK can actually help to resolve some of the sort of domestic challenges that we have. But it obviously needs to be paired with that international dimension as well that we've kind of talked about today. And then just to pick up the point on regulation as well, I think that we also need to see a much more integrated approach to regulation as well, so that nature isn't something that is just siloed into a specific subset of regulation, but we have a so wide perspective on regulation that looks at how does that support our net zero and nature sort of ambitions across the board. How do we make sure that the private sector play their part through the kind of regulations and guidance that the government can put in place? So having a slightly more sort of cross-sectoral and cross-government perspective as well in how we evaluate regulation and policy measures will be useful as well.
Absolutely. Wouldn't that be good? A lens of biodiversity looking across the whole policy landscape. Kate, have you got some thoughts?
Well, I've really got a question for my colleagues on the panel, because they're going to hopefully be able to answer this question rather better than I, because when we've seen ministers before us on our committee, and we've been asking them, you know, who have you been talking to about your approach to COP15, they've come back to us and said, well, we have got a business advisory group who are advising us on our approach to CBD. And, you know, I'd be interested to know, particularly Signe, if you know of any of your members who are involved, because we need to make sure that the businesses that are talking to government are the ones that are open to, recognising that if we don't get this biodiversity challenge sorted, then their businesses are at stake, but equally they are part of the solution. And so we need businesses, and I think David mentioned Nestle. I'm sure there are others who are struggling. It's a difficult area, but at least, you know, trying to come up with some of the right things to say. So I just wondered if any of you knew who might be on this government business advisory group as it moves towards COP15.
It's an excellent question, and I will admit to not knowing the membership of it, but I think that you are certainly right in that there are a lot of businesses who want to act on this, and there are ambitions in place. Nestle is one of our members, and we know that they're looking at how they can actively support this. But I think that it would certainly, we would certainly welcome a so wider also engagement with the business community building up to COP15 to look at what do they perceive as the barriers and the opportunities as well ahead of that conference, because it can really help arm the UK in the negotiations to help push along progress.
I'm afraid I can't help you either, Kate. I'm sorry to say. Our membership involves people like the House Builders Federation, the Food and Drink Association. So they're the peak bodies are our members, and I'm sure some of the individual businesses are engaged. I have observed, and this is purely anecdotal, that I think the finance sector's voice is probably louder in some respects than the business sector, if you see the distinction. And I don't know that that's the right answer. As somebody pointed out the other day, is farmers don't really need to know where they can go and borrow money. They need to know how they can make money from nature. And yes, I think it's the businesses that are going to invest in those local communities, those local delivery models, and improving their supply chains. They're the ones that are going to be the most important in actually driving on-ground action, I think.
I'll just add, we often talk of sort of business as a sort of amorphous entity, but we must stress the diversity, and therefore the challenge would be to DEFRA and others preparing for COP15. You know, is it well, I don't know the membership of the group that they've got, but does it reflect the full diversity of business? Of course, we need to remember, yes, there are farm businesses, and it's smaller enterprise, which is actually, you know, the lion's share of the economy. So I'd suggest we need groups that are preparing for those involved in, you know, pulp, paper, timber, forestry. We need another group of, you know, financial services. We need, you know, the small local businesses. We need another advisory panel for farm businesses. We need umpteen of these groups which can give their individual capabilities, express those and feed those into the negotiation.
Thank you. So clearly a lot of strength of feeling around the input from business that's needed. But what are going to be the challenges, the opportunities as well, and the challenges facing business in trying to pick up this, trying to bring biodiversity into the mainstream of what they do day to day? Bruce, I'm going to start with you.
Happy to start on that. I think there is an emergent challenge. There's a concern about sort of new financial transactions, whether it's businesses acquiring land in order to fulfill their net gain and environmental concerns, or whether it's them providing money to other people who look after land. I think I'm picking up there's quite a lot of concern, I know there is in Wales and Scotland in particular, about business involvement in stewardship of the natural environment beyond obviously all the farm businesses we already have. And I think that's a problem that's yet to be cracked, so that the money that's changing hands is doing so in a way that local communities will accept. We hear about this sort of brewdog case in Scotland, brewdog land, and that's sort of been you know, a big problem for so many. It's sort of sent shockwaves of concern about, you know, new land acquisition. And we really have to explain that brewdog case and perhaps allay people's concerns, because these new environmental markets, if well designed, and financing UK Nature Recovery that David's led is sort of expressed what that means, if we have them well designed, the gains are massive. But if the public concern over these transactions really catches on in an unfortunate way, then it could really damage this, in a sense, one and only opportunity that we've got to restore nature by involving business.
Absolutely.
Can I come in on that? Because I think Bruce has hit on a really, really important point, because biodiversity for people is about place. It's about their area, and there's a lot of emotion that gets tied into that. And if we don't get that, if we don't think of ways to involve communities in the decisions, if it becomes purely a sort of a financial transaction to achieve an end nature result, as Bruce rightly says, the evidence is that people will up with this we will not put, and then businesses will back off because they're trying to make money to survive. They're not going to want to take on these communities. So the whole area of consent around these schemes has got to be thought through really, really carefully. And I have to say, this is a government that is very scared about having what I would say is a mature conversation with consumers stroke citizens about issues which impact on their life. I mean, we've only got to think about the net zero strategy, where the government responsible said, well, we're going to get technology to solve most of this, but we're going to work with the grain of consumer choice, i.e. we're not going to try and tell people what to do, whereas actually governments have to have a mature conversation with citizens and consumers that engages them in the process. And a good example of this would be the parliamentary process of the Climate Assembly, where you bring people together, you tell them what the problem is, and you involve them in coming up with some of the solutions. So I think Bruce has hit on something that, yes, we can talk about resources and we can talk about finance in terms of what comes out of COP15, but if we don't at the same time in each of our individual countries think about the process of consent and taking local communities with us, we stand a jolly good chance of coming up with some solutions that just aren't going to work.
That's a really important point, isn't it? This concept of we'll all still be riding in airplanes and we'll all still be doing whatever we like, but technology will sort it all out, and will be hydrogen powered planes or whatever it is, doesn't apply in the biodiversity argument. You can't come up with a technological solution to, you know, how is the water cycle going to function? How is this biodiversity going to be maintained in a particular area? And so we really do have to get down to having those hard conversations about what we as a society are prepared to change. David.
Yeah, I want to pick up on, well, how do you achieve what Bruce and Kate have really articulated so well? And join it up with an earlier conversation about the need to rethink the way that public funding is spent. You know, we've lived, and I'll put my hand up and say I was the architect of the original Rural Development Programme for England, with a highly centralised, top-down, programmatic delivery mechanism, which farmers resent enormously for the extent of kind of micromanagement and scrutiny over their operation, but more importantly, doesn't actually put resources into the communities to mobilise other resources and combine the resources locally. In other countries that I'm familiar with, national sort of environmental strategies are then immediately delegated to communities to come up with their local action plans, with the commitment that there is going to be funding of those plans into the future. So instead of having a central environmental land management scheme that sort of goes from the top all the way down to the individual farm field, you actually put resources in the hands of a governance mechanism, an appropriate governance mechanism in a local community, and say, look, we'll fund your strategy to £20 million over the next 5 years, provided you can get matching private funding. Mm-hmm. And if you achieve the matching private funding, we'll give you a bonus of another £5 million. That's when you start to get you'll start to mobilise the private finance. The current approach to thinking on the environmental land management schemes is a long, long way away from that.
Thank you. Signe, what are your thoughts around the challenges and opportunities for business?
Well, I would say that, I mean, certainly I think everyone's raised some really terrific points. I think also a more fundamental point, I think it's also worth recognizing that this is a highly complex area. And I think that in and of itself is why it is hard to find maybe sort of substantial sort of business examples in kind of restoring nature, because it is so complex, and we need to acknowledge that when we look at how do we have a greater role for businesses in this agenda. And I think it hasn't been exactly helped by the fact that there's been slow progress internationally. And the fact that we're having this discussion and we have COP15 is useful in that regard to kind of help crystallize what do we mean by nature restoration, biodiversity, what is the role of private finance. And I think the more that we can have these dialogues, I think the better. It will kind of help, at least at an international level, crystallize it. But I think just coming back to some of the points, particularly around elms being mentioned, I think that it's very important that we also acknowledge that historically we've also had a very siloed approach to kind of policy and regulatory frameworks, and that does not help us in this regard, because as useful and as welcome as elms is, you know, with public money for public goods approach, it's not going to solve all of our challenges when it comes to biodiversity. And we need to look at this, as we were kind of discussing earlier, almost through a kind of climate and nature lens across the board, because otherwise it becomes very siloed and it becomes a series of pilots or individual frameworks or specific policies, where actually what we need is kind of a refreshed look across the board. And I think that unless we kind of start looking at this through a more holistic lens, I think that some of those challenges will remain for some of the private sectors in specific areas of the economy. I do also think that we talked just briefly about the place-based perspective on some of these actions that we need to address. I think another challenge is that we have seen a kind of knowledge gap emerge over sort of recent years, when you've seen local authorities not have as many ecologists on board and kind of the environmental professionals to play a part at the local level. And I think that that's another area where we need to seriously think about how can we better equip local authorities and regional authorities to play a greater role in looking at their national or natural environment. So I think that there's quite a lot of barriers and challenges, but I think that the fact that we're having this discussion is still a useful exercise, and it will kind of help us get to some of these challenges and kind of identify solutions and next steps.
Thank you. Are there different roles that can be played by organisations of different sizes? You know, how do you view the role that the SMEs can play in this compared with the large multinationals? Is it similar to issues around climate, for example, where it's not necessarily the big emitters who have the biggest adaptation issues to deal with? I'm going to go to David first.
I think in some respects, SMEs are both have the biggest challenges and the biggest opportunities. As in any of these environmental areas, the SMEs struggle to get access to the resources and the expertise to figure out what it is that they could do or should do. I mean, you see that even in the house building sector, you know, dealing with nutrient neutrality, for example. The big developers, they can sort those issues out. But how is a small home builder who's building 5 or 10 homes a year expected to go out and suddenly be sourcing, you know, nutrient offsets just so that they can get the planning approval? There's a need to have access to skills and capabilities that the larger companies can, in a sense, look after themselves. On the other hand, it's the SMEs that are the place-based local partners. They're the natural partners for the environment. They're natural partners for biodiversity. And I mean, we can have lots and lots of arguments about what's the correct boundary and administrative boundary. And over the years, I've sort of flipped between local government areas and, you know, areas of outstanding natural beauty. You know, I've settled on catchments. And catchments are a biogeophysical space. They're not perfect, but they are places where it makes sense. You can stand in a catchment and you can understand the way the natural environment works and describe it and engage people in it. And I think a strong emphasis on bringing businesses together in their catchments is an important opportunity for small business.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that, Bruce?
Well, yeah, to that end, good to give a shout out for the Landscape Enterprise Networks model, which shows huge promise in terms of gathering together the demand from businesses for an environment that they can operate in resiliently and in a way that's friendly to local communities. Understanding that demand and then looking for the land managers who can supply these services to meet that demand. So landscape enterprise networks being developed in England, Scotland, and elsewhere in Europe, great promise there, and potentially involving some much smaller businesses as well. Perhaps, a business park buys into a landscape enterprise scheme on behalf of all its individual the much smaller enterprises based within it. So these sort of models are emerging. I think they just need the resourcing of all of the negotiation and brokering that's required.
Absolutely. I have a question really for Kate next, which is around what's the role for government intervention, either to facilitate business change or individual behaviour change? How much should we be looking to regulation for this, and how much are we leaving to the private sector?
Well, I'm a strong believer that we need strong regulation. And the evidence that I've seen over the years is that businesses seem to want a level playing field. No one wants to go out and be an outrider, but they can see where the targets are, but they know they need to have a level playing field. And the way to do that is to regulate. I don't think this government fully yet has bought into that model. There's some examples in the Environment Act where they've started to say, we will look to increase the regulation and put some more restrictions around businesses. I mean, and a sort of a parallel example would be the new biodiversity net gain, which is meant to help move developments in the right sort of way and levy some funding into biodiversity schemes from developers. But I feel they need to do a lot more. So I think the opportunity to do regulation, the opportunity is much higher, but also it's really important because it's no good if and I also really strongly believe in people being encouraged and helped to consume better products. But it's no good if I say, look, I want to go and buy a product which supports nature, and then I get to the supermarket and I can't find out what it is, or equally, the regulations means that the sort of products I want aren't there because there's still a free-for-all around plastics. I mean, basically government has a role, as I see it, sort of upstream of the individuals to create a level playing field so that businesses know where they should be operating, and it then enables consumers to come in after that and make the positive choices because the options are already there. And if government doesn't do that job first, it's going to be much harder for consumers. So that's quite a simplistic approach. I mean, behaviour change is really tricky. And in fact, my committee has just launched an inquiry into how you mobilise behaviour change for climate and nature, because it's such an important area, and one where the government at the moment we feel aren't doing enough. But yeah, the government has to. It cannot not regulate businesses. It's absolutely critical, and it not just in the UK, but globally. And I may not be the best fan of this government, but I do take my hat off to them for introducing this due diligence obligation on companies for the agricultural products which are contributing to deforestation. That, I think, is the sort of thing that we need to be seeing a lot more of. And congratulations to them for bringing it in, or hoping to bring it in.
Any other thoughts on regulation, the sorts of regulation we'd like to see in this area? Thank you, David, then Signe.
Outcome-based regulation. Most of the regulation we have at the moment is regulating activities or inputs. It's not even outputs. And it's around the outcomes, and it goes to Bruce's point about the landscape enterprise networks as an example. You can mobilize vision, energy, and enthusiasm around outcomes for the environment, outcomes for nature. It's a bit harder to get excited around the sort of you know, the prescription of, you know, the design of a sewage outfall. People care an awful lot though about whether the beaches are clean.
Indeed.
You know, so it's just, you know, but that's the way it works, right? The regulation is not focusing on outcomes, and if you focus on the inputs, business is basically just does what it's told, and it doesn't use the one thing that business is great at, and that is innovation and efficient delivery. Mm-hmm. So you don't get the solutions and you don't get efficiency because the regulation is prescriptive.
Yeah, the regulation is prescriptive, but also there's no, companies innovate when there's a first mover advantage to doing something different. In terms of making products or services more sustainable, there's quite often a first mover disadvantage in terms of your price point, which is going to, you know, make it harder for you to compete until there's some sort of leveling up around how sustainable you've got to be, and then people can compete on that basis.
Absolutely.
I'm going to get to Signe next. Thanks.
No, I think David might have wanted to make another point. But
all right.
Then I'll continue. Sorry, David. But I was just going to say, I think I completely agree with that. And one of the things that we consistently hear in engaging with our members at the Aldersgate group is just how important that level playing field is across the board, but also that, as was kind of alluded to by Kate very eloquently, is that like environmental regulation is actually something which is good and can actually generate growth. It generates jobs, investment in skills, it develops new supply chains, new services, new products. And the key there is really to have environmental regulations that are so forward-looking, they are underpinned by very clear and ambitious targets which tighten over time. So you have a ramping up, but not a cliff edge. It's also something where we need to look at the kind of enforcement of them, and which comes to a point I made earlier around the resourcing of regulators, but also increasingly that it's joined up, that you see it work across different sectors, and that you have, where possible, cross-sectoral regulation as well, so that it's not something that applies to only one specific part of the economy and not another one. So you get a more integrated approach to that, because by having a more robust regulatory framework, you actually generate a lot of the economic opportunities that we want to see, and we can also get the environmental benefits coming with those improvements with relatively, you know, almost no kind of public sector investment. You can get that from the private sector, but you need that level playing field to clarify what it is that you're looking at. And one thing on that I also wanted to make sure that we mentioned with when it comes to kind of policy and regulation, etc., the often forgot bit of this, which I know Kate mentioned at the beginning, is also the role of trade, because obviously businesses don't operate on a silo, they often operate on international markets, and we need to have a trade sort of trade deals that essentially acknowledges this and protect our right to regulate in the UK, and also make sure that we don't accidentally undermine domestic progress in introducing nature-friendly or climate-friendly products by having sort of cheaper imports, that we kind of have that holistic approach of how do we see competitiveness, how do we see environmental improvement, and how can we embed these and kind of make it more cost-effective as well.
Excellent, thank you. Bruce, did you want to come in on regulation?
Only on the point that around some of these emergent environmental markets, there was a need for some flexible, David mentioned it's sort of outcome focused, but I think some flexibility on the part of the regulators around the UK will help, because when you're using sort of nature-based solutions to deliver outcomes, naturally, sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't, especially when they're being tried out. I think I'm picking up the sort of nervousness, perhaps natural flood management, what if it fails and, a location gets flooded, would be safeguarded. That there's a lot of uncertainty there, and we've got to sort of acknowledge that and embrace it. Regulation of kind of engineered structures is perhaps a lot easier than natural structures.
Absolutely. So thinking about then one of the elements that's obviously going to be quite relevant to CIEEM members, I'm sure, is around biodiversity net gain. What is the role there for monetization of nature? We're looking at biodiversity credits that have a value that may potentially be traded. What are you feeling about that as a way forward in delivering what needs to come out of COP15, or is it a sideshow? I'm going to go to David.
I'll confess to be in both involved in, but also committed to creating these markets for nature. Mm-hmm. I think, though, and it goes back to the earlier point, is that we must look at the outcomes for nature as a whole. And I think sort of looking at nature in its silos and creating markets for carbon and markets for biodiversity and markets for, nutrients and things is quite high risk, because nature actually delivers all of those benefits, and landowners need to get rewarded for the services they're providing. And if they're providing all those services, they need to be allowed to, I guess, benefit from that if we're going to get the scale of land use change that we need. So I don't think that the biodiversity net gain model is going to lead to nature's recovery. What it is an important mechanism for doing is halting decline, because it basically guarantees, at least for those developments that need approval, that they're not going backwards. But some of the things that the biodiversity net gain mechanism have developed on the face of the bill, such as allowing land to be biodiversity gain land, and the use of the metric and the tool to measure that and quantify that, are very important foundations for then a thriving market in being nature positive. In other words, investing in the connected habitats across the landscape that will actually deliver the recovery. So there's a lot of work to do to create a framework for these markets which is joined up and is not going to lead to perverse incentives, monocultures of, as we know, the carbon landscapes. There's now talk about nutrient landscapes. We need to get the incentives right. And unfortunately, the biodiversity net gain mechanism does risk distorting the markets in such a way that they're not integrated. And I don't have enough time to talk about the perils of introducing incredibly difficult standards for stacking and bundling and additionality that just add enormous cost to these projects. Somebody recently said to me, why don't we treat nature-based solutions as presumed innocent? In other words, these are good things that we should be doing. And as Bruce says, let's give them a bit of flexibility and get them happening on the ground. And you know what? If there's a little bit of kind of failure at the edges, it won't matter too much, because we will have actually achieved so much across the landscape.
And we'll have actually committed to putting some land back to nature. Exactly. And towards hitting our 30 by 30 target. Yeah. Bruce, I don't know if you want to come back on that at all, based on, I know the Systems Knowledge Network have developed tools around environmental net gain and trying to build in more of this whole view of what nature does, rather than just looking at biodiversity on its own.
Yes, so I think we need to get clear on whether we're talking about biodiversity net gain achieved through the planning system, or whether we're talking, as David's indicated, sort of biodiversity net gain for all sorts of business activity, whether it comes under the planning system or not. I've always been slightly puzzled by why people get, including the Natural Capital Committee, got very excited about biodiversity net gain, because I don't think there are some up-to-date figures, but analysis done a few years ago suggested that we're dealing with about 10,000 hectares in England a year coming forward for development, and therefore eligible to participate in the sort of biodiversity offsetting, as it was then called. I mean, that's tiny. Locally, really significant. Nationally, totally insignificant. So I think we've got to be very cautious about thinking, net gain, it's sort of an essential part of the toolbox of restoring the UK's natural environment. And obviously the interest is really only in England at the moment. Yes, environmental net gain is the way forward, and indeed there is a tool that's recently been launched for that, and the Natural England tool, Environmental Benefits of Nature tool as well, and that there is a lot of opportunity for businesses to kind of assess their impacts on the natural environment kind of as a whole, their local impacts at least, and find a way of compensating for that. So yeah, within the planning system, important but not a game changer. Net gain within business more generally, yes, highly significant.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's really important that we sort of get these things out in the open and see how it has to be part of a bigger raft of measures. Now, I think we've got some questions from the audience, but I'm going to ask one or two of those next, I think. So we have a question that says, I have very little understanding of business, so excuse if this is a naive question, but how can businesses make money from investing in nature? It's not a naive question, it's a great question. So, yes, perhaps you'd like to just comment briefly on that. How is that mechanism actually going to work? How will businesses or investors see a return on investing in nature? So this isn't just paying for an offset to compensate for an impact that you've had. This is how can you actually invest in nature and make a return?
David, do you want to start on that? Me too. Jump in.
Yes, it's all about revenue. It's all about revenues from nature. The fundamental point is nature delivers services. At the moment, those services are provided for free. There is no market for nature. So people don't value what they don't pay for. So we need mechanisms to cause those services to be paid for. And some of those will have to be paid for by government, but others can be provided for and funded by business, where those services are clearly benefiting those businesses. And I use the water sector as an example. To the extent to which a water company, instead of building energy-intensive, carbon-intensive, chemical-intensive treatment facilities, is able to create and build wetlands that reduce the nutrients flowing into rivers, and at the same time do so and make a profit from doing so because it's cheaper than the alternative, then the incentives start to be aligned. And as Nestle has shown, that putting time into communities and businesses that are supplying their raw materials and their foodstuffs is going to make savings for them in terms of quality assurance, irrespective of whether or not the consumer at the end of the chain is aware of what they have done and values their brand more highly as a result. In terms of investors, we need to start to see the natural environment as a natural asset, and an asset that can be put onto businesses' balance sheets. These long-term solutions, if you like, 30-year biodiversity agreements, that should or could be an asset, so that if the landowner themselves can't afford to invest in the biodiversity recovery, a private investor can come and join with them and take a share of, let's say, the biodiversity credits that are produced as a result. And then they can sell those credits, and then they can earn a return from that investment. So the models and the financial models are being built now, and they're being tested, and there are some examples. But until the regulatory framework is sorted out, going back to an earlier point, it's going to be challenging.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Would anybody else like to add to that?
Just to say, it's all about linking buyers and sellers once those transactions start to take place. Just like any business of any type, once there's turnover and there's a viable trading is going on, then investors get interested in providing finance that will enable those businesses to grow, and of course those investors then will require a return on their investment. So step one is to look at the integrated, fair, people-centric markets. When they're established, then you bet investors will take an interest. And of course, there's many different types of investors. So there are some investors which very early on will want to get involved, even if the returns aren't great. And then there are other sort of investors that will come in requiring much higher rates of return later on. So, and we also need to think, well, in UK forestry, for example, there are already investors, there are people buying land, investing in forestry projects. Whatever you think of sustainable forestry, as it's put, investors are involved there. It's a question of then extending perhaps from that to other land uses.
Yeah, and I think it also complements the points that Gupta is making very clear in his report, in that we also don't fully understand the value of nature yet. And I think the more we can improve that, the more we also see further clarity, I think, for businesses on how they can sort of invest in nature and the monetized sort of value in that, because I think that I think the question is quite good, and I think it also illustrates the fact that we have some way to go to make that wider picture clear and investable for a lot of businesses. But I think that, I mean, we've heard certainly from David and Bruce some fantastic initiatives, but I think that at a fundamental level as well is about clarifying exactly what value nature has in the kind of monetary terms, because once we can measure it, once we can see the impact it has, the more valuable it will become, even though we know from an individual level that it's valuable and we treasure it in our individual local areas and so on. I think it will just help drive that wider transformational change.
If I can just add one other sort of final point to this debate, and thank you to all of the colleagues, because that's been really helpful to me. Well, we've talked a lot about, you need the regulation, and it's not going to be easy until we've got that. The other thing that the government does have to think about is fiscal levers that it can pull. I mean, you can make it easier for business if there are financial penalties if they're doing things, and that's something we haven't touched on, and which this government in the past, I think the percentage of taxation in the UK which goes on green issues is somewhere around 2%. I mean, it's absolutely minuscule. And I have to say that I think, using that fiscal lever and getting the Treasury to really reevaluate what we're, where we are taxing and what we're not taxing, and looking at our climate and our biodiversity goals is an absolutely urgent priority for this Treasury to get on and do.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And that sort of question has very neatly brought us back around to sort of where we started when we started off by talking about the Dasgupta review. It's been a fantastic discussion. I've really enjoyed talking with you all this afternoon, but we're almost out of time. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground, and it will have been really helpful for CIEEM members to listen to all of your views on how business and finance can work towards the requirements of COP15. Just a reminder to say that this episode has been recorded, so you can watch it back again if you'd like to on the CIEEM YouTube channel or in the Resource Hub. The first webinar last week is already available to watch in the same place. So all that remains for me to do is to say thank you so much to our fantastic panelists, Bruce Howard, Signe Norberg, Kate Parminter and David Young. We've really all enjoyed your insights this afternoon. Thank you very much for listening, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.